the post-apocalyptic genre next on Retro Serial. Hey everyone, welcome to Retro Serial. I'm your host, DNC. I'm glad you could be joining me for today's program. On today's program, we have returning guest Thrashpondo and I, and he is very much a guest rather than a co-host on this episode because I had him on as an expert on the post-apocalyptic genre of movie, books, and TV shows. And that's kind of what we talk about. We talk mostly about movies, but we also talk about television shows and a little bit about books. You know how conversations, they go everywhere. So we're going to get right into that. However, before we do, let me encourage you to hit that subscribe button, hit the like button, hit the bell notification if you want to know when these things are available, and go ahead and share this on your favorite social media. If you're listening to this on podcast form only, I would really appreciate a rating and review. And as always, I'm glad you're listening no matter what platform you're listening on, either the podcast or the YouTube page. But just so you know, if you are a podcast listener and you like what you're hearing here about growing up Generation X, head on over to the YouTube page because there are some things on the YouTube page that are kind of exclusive on YouTube. And one final thing before we jump into the show, and that is you can always support us on our Patreon page. We have 2 levels of support right now. The first level of support is just our tip jar, $3 a month, just to say, hey, like what you're doing, keep up the good work. And then the second level is our Cornflake Club, where you get early releases at least 24 hours in advance, or at least 1 day in advance on all podcasts and all videos. After that, I'm going to be doing this. I know I've said this, but things kind of move slowly around here, so bear with me. But we are going to be doing a Honeycomb Hideout, where if you're part of the Honeycomb Hideout, you will get exclusive material. I'm working on that right now, so bear with me, but it is coming. So with all that said, I think that's everything I wanted to say. Yeah, I think it is. Let's go ahead and get into the interview. All right, everyone. Hey, got Thrashpondo Ponds with me, as most always these days. Awesome. I'm glad you could join me again, and I really appreciate you. We were talking on the show over on Retro Serial last time about post-apocalyptic movies that came up. And you are an aficionado on post-apocalyptic movies to a degree.
Yeah, insofar as anyone could be an expert on anything. I think I am, let's just say, better than average or above.
Okay.
And you can take that to the bank.
All right. Well, let me just start with a little bit with my story, because I love post-apocalyptic movies as well. And then I want to start with your story as well, like how you got into it. But I mean, my introduction into post-apocalyptic movies would have to be The Road Warrior. And then at that time when I saw The Road Warrior, it was on HBO or something like that. So it wasn't when it came out, it was after it came out, because I remember seeing it on TV. But that was the first time that I had ever seen a scenario in which the world kind of as we know it, society as we know it, economics as we know it, culture as we know it had come to an end, and something new was starting, and something new was emerging. So that's my introduction into post-apocalyptic, and then plus there's more, because I want to talk about all the movies here. I mean, as many as we can get to. But and I think that saying that kind of establishes the genre too, but let me just get your opinion on this. What is a post-apocalyptic movie? First of all, what do you consider it to be? And what's your introduction to the world of post-apocalyptic shows?
I'm glad you asked, because there is a distinction. There are 2 schools of thought, and there's a difference between the 2 of them. Post-apocalyptic fiction, or a post-apocalyptic story, is when all avenues, all areas of civilization are gone. We pretty much go back to a hunter-gatherer situation. There are some leftovers from the past. People wander wastelands, gathering up bits and pieces of technology, trying to survive and find new uses for them. But for the most part, we're back to square one. There is nothing. And then there's something called dystopian. Dystopian is a little more gray area. That's something more like 1984, where it's a future we wouldn't want. It has a lot of negative aspects to it, but there is still a functional, operational form of government and society that is available. Just one that is sort of nightmarish. Dystopians can actually be worse than post-apocalyptic. Bite my tongue there. But I tend to stick to the post-apocalyptic for a couple of reasons, which I will get into. But I have to tell you, my introduction to post-apocalyptic film came purely by accident. Now, I've always been a sci-fi buff. I used to watch old sci-fi movies with my father when I was in preschool. That was our Saturday afternoons. But my mom took me to the movies in the late 70s, and she took me to what looked like a fun fantasy action romp cartoon called Wizards.
Oh,
Now,
okay.
have you seen Wizards, by the way?
No, I've not seen it, but I know of it.
Wizards is one of the most interesting films in the genre. It was made by Ralph Bakshi, who's known for making some naughty movies, which I won't get into for right now. But he worked on a collaboration of the Tolkien trilogy. And that's probably his best mainstream work. But Wizards is something absolutely amazing. It takes place in the distant, distant future. And what has happened is there's an atomic war, which has completely destroyed civilization. He even talks about a nuclear winter and other things. That was one of the key elements to getting into a post-apocalyptic fantasy. There had to be some type of what they call an extinction event. There had to be some triggering mechanism. And back in the 70s and 80s, it was almost always World War III. Because let's face facts, World War III seemed like it was around the corner. And what this one did, long story short, when Earth is destroyed, it almost triggers a new type of evolution. And Gaia, planet Earth, brings back her earlier mystical creations. So you see a rebirth in dwarves and elves. You also have the other angle that radiation always brings, the mutants. And there's this entire civilization of mutants which is living side by side. And the reason it's called Wizards is two brothers who are wizards, one good, one evil. That's a wonderful and oldie but goodie trope. And they basically face off in this final showdown. So one of them, the evil wizard, decides his edge is to find old school technology. And he uncovers World War II propaganda. So to sum it all up, on one side you have Nazi mutants.
Okay.
On the other side you have dwarves and elves fighting a last battle for Earth's future. And what could possibly be cooler? And that basically set me on a path where post-apocalyptic fiction was one of my favorites. So you can thank Ralph Bakshi for that.
It's one of my favorites too. There's a couple of things you said and I want to pick up on, but I got a question to ask you first of all. Did the guy who did Wizards, was he the same guy who did the animation for The Wall?
No, a lot of people speculate that. I've also heard people have asked if it was Terry Gilliam. No, it was a different production company. He may have worked with it because he worked with various production companies from time to time. But no, it was an unrelated party.
Okay, all right. It's just that I know that the cartoon kind of drawings of the wizard look a lot like what you see in The Wall, the show The Wall. So I just wondered if that's an off topic though. Let me get back to the point. This is interesting that you bring this up because I didn't really know that post-apocalyptic movies would include dystopias. But it makes sense to me now that you bring it up. And I understand why there might be a little bit of a fight over that, a little bit of a disagreement, because really, is it a post-apocalyptic situation if there is a dystopia, because normally dystopia movies has some type of, under the guise of benevolent government, but really nefarious, doing something bad, like killing the old people off or something like that.
Perfect example.
Yeah.
Soylent Green is the litmus test
Yeah.
because it's truly post-apocalyptic, but there is still a functioning government going on.
Right.
So one could make a valid case on either side, but that's you hit the nail, bam, right on the head.
So it's kind of like a lot of them seem to be that do have dystopia and post-apocalyptic mixture there. It's normally a government that's kind of come into existence as a result of some crisis, like a nuclear war, or like the crash of the economy, or a plague, or something like that. But let's see. So some of my favorite, let's get into some of my favorites. So Wizards, I've not seen. Okay. So I have to admit that I've not seen that. I've seen clips of that, but I think there's like a top 10 things you didn't know about Wizards or something like that I've watched before. I mean, you showed me that, and I know that I've seen pieces of it, but I've not sat through the show. But I'm going to have to put that on my list because I love post-apocalyptic movies. Now, another thing that factors into this very heavily, and I don't know which came first, and we'll get into favorites here in a minute, but I got to kind of set the groundwork for theories about post-apocalyptic, and that is preppers and kind of like the Christian far right. Those are two. Also, they kind of blend together with post-apocalyptic scenarios, and then along with that is this whole idea of that you mentioned about World War III as well, because everybody thought we were going, there was going to be a nuclear explosion, and there was going to be, and then plus, in addition to this, and I want to talk about each one of these in movies, because I'm sure you've seen this as well. You've seen probably this idea of an antichrist or something like that in some of these post-apocalyptic movies, where you have like a benevolent government takeover from a rapture or something like that. I know you've seen that, but so some of my, I don't know exactly where to go because there's so many directions we could go, but I do want to talk about some of my favorite post-apocalyptic movies, especially those of the 80s. And one of them was a made-for-TV with Steve Guttenberg, where they had the nuclear holocaust, and
the day after.
Oh, there we go.
The day after.
The day after. All right. So talk to me about the difference between apocalyptic shows, post-apocalyptic shows in the 70s versus the 80s. Now that I've said a bunch of stuff and I rambled on and I don't even know exactly where to go, but I think that's a good place to kind of start. Do you see a difference between post-apocalyptic shows in the 70s and the 80s, and what were some of those differences?
Yes, I do. In fact, not to get too much into the history of it, one of the amazing things about the 70s was it had a sense of adventure, even with things like post-World War III. Gene Roddenberry, and I talked about this in one of my posts on my channel, he actually made 3 separate pilots for a TV series. I don't know if you're familiar with the Dylan Hunt saga, I guess you'd call it.
No.
Long story short, it was intended to be, Dylan Hunt was his hero. He was part of an experiment with cryogenics. The experiment goes wrong and he stays frozen through a nuclear war. Wakes up in this post-apocalyptic civilization, comes in contact with some good people who are fighting some bad people, and goes on a number of adventures trying to bring the world back on its feet. That's the very encapsulated plot synopsis. And it would be like The Fugitive with a post-apocalyptic backdrop. 2 of the pilots starred John Saxon, another one, I can't remember the guy's name, but again, each week they would have this challenge and have to overcome it, and then he'd move on to a different part of the country or world and repeat the process until the world is back on its feet. Wasn't picked up, but it was more of an adventurous romp than a true depiction of how tragic a post-nuclear war would be. There are some others. Some are grim, like A Boy and His Dog, which they could never make that movie these days. But it had more of an adventurous feel to it, as opposed to in the 80s, when I think there was more awareness towards a nuclear war and just how truly destructive it would be. People didn't seem to want to have this sort of I don't want to say looking forward to it, but they were far more grim about it. So the post-apocalyptic stories in turn became more grim and gritty. And I can't say realistic because none of them are particularly realistic. I think possibly the best one would be Cormac McCarthy's The Road, and even that, all the experts say that's a picnic compared to what a post-apocalyptic, a post-nuclear war Earth would look like. But the Road Warrior was gritty. He eats dog food. He wanders a wasteland. There are roving bands of scavengers who are predators and possibly cannibals, and it has a really just grim feel to it. I mean, it's funny that was your first exposure, because I hold that when you look at the post-apocalyptic subgenre, there is before the Road Warrior and after the Road Warrior. And you want to hear something, a cute little tidbit? Most people think that the global war it was off camera, of course, but they think it was actually between Mad Max and the Road Warrior. And in fact, no. If you go back as far as Mad Max, the atomic war had already taken place. In fact, it's sort of like, I don't know if any of you out there are familiar with On the Beach by Neville Shute. Long story short, a nuclear war destroys the Northern Hemisphere, because, little secret, that's where the two main nuclear powers would have been. The Southern Hemisphere manages to survive for a while.
Okay.
And so what's happening in Mad Max is there's a collapse of the global economy because of World War III in the Northern Hemisphere. But Australia and some of the Southern Hemisphere countries are sort of plodding along. Things then go downhill with the collapse of what's left of the economy, and that's where you get the Road Warrior. But even Mad Max is post-war, and I found that to be very interesting.
Yeah,
when you look at the saga.
That is interesting. I've seen the Road Warrior, and I've tried to sit through Mad Max a couple times, but I've never really been able to pull it off. I saw the Road Warrior, and then I saw the Beyond Thunderdome, and then of course I saw the new one. What amazes me is that this is still part of our society, and it's part of our there's a large majority of people who romanticize kind of a post-apocalyptic ideas.
Yes.
And I have, to a degree,
Even
like
today.
if you woke up tomorrow and you didn't have to go to work, and then suddenly everything's, hunt, like you're saying, hunt back to a hunter-gatherer situation because of a war or a plague or zombies or whatever. What would your life be like? And you're like, oh, well, there'd be some bad stuff, but there'd be some perks as well. You definitely think about that. And it's still today. I mean, I've still got friends who are very much like preppers, that are very much like, oh, it's all going to end. They've been saying it's going to end for decades, decades and decades. It's going to be 2 more years. Oh, 2 more years, we're going to be out of here. 2 more years, is going to be out of here. And then every latest scare is just like, oh my gosh, it's going to happen. I mean, we're going to go down, and we're going to have to anyways. It gets tiresome. That's actually one large element of Christianity that I that's just tiresome to listen to. I mean, quite honestly, I've been listening to this since I've been a little kid. It's all about to end any minute, and we're all going to have to have guns and our survival, food source and all this stuff. So it's still with us today. I mean, this is still a big deal. They still are producing post-apocalyptic shows even today, and it's still a big deal today, although kind of the situation evolves. One of the latest emanations of this is the zombie genre, and the zombie show, The Walking Dead. That's a post-apocalyptic as well, but that's brought on by by a plague or something like that, some virus or something. But all right, let's get to it. Let's get to this, because I got some movies I want to throw your way.
Yeah.
I want to hear your opinion, and then I want to hear other movies that you've watched that I haven't watched that would fall under this genre. Okay. One of my favorite, so we already talked about The Road Warrior, but one of my favorite is Night of the Comet.
I love Night of the Comet. I had the biggest crush on Kelly when I was a kid.
Yeah.
The cheerleader.
Yes.
In fact, little tidbit, I actually reviewed Night of the Comet again on my channel. And one of the things I found out doing my research, John, I'm going to get his name wrong, Josh Whedon, the guy who did Firefly and Buffy, when he was conceptualizing Buffy as a sort of warrior cheerleader, he used Kelly Mariano from Night of the Comet as a template. She went around in her cheerleader outfit with a MAC-10 killing zombies. And he extrapolated that to Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Instead of zombies, it's vampires.
Right.
But yes, I love that movie as well.
I loved it too. And I had, again, that was 80s. So 70s A Night of the Comet, or 70s post-apocalyptic shows I'm not as familiar with, and because I was a young kid. I was born in the 70s, but I was really young. 80s is when I kind of started being aware of the world and things like that, what's going on in the world, and movies, and getting interested in things. So 80s is kind of where it all kind of starts for me with a lot of things. 70s stuff I go back to is more retrospect. 80s is like I lived through it, and I remember that. But I also remember, romanticizing it in my own head, thinking, well, what if we woke up and there was a comet, and he came out and everybody was dust except for people who slept in lead or something like that. That was kind of the idea of that show. And then, of course, not everybody died, but some people got infected, or or became, like you said, mutants or whatever. I mean, it was just it would be an interesting world. Picking up sticks in my backyard and pretending they're swords or lightsabers or guns, and there's some type of post-apocalyptic world. Which brings me to another point that I want to hear your thoughts on. What is the crossover between post-apocalyptic and sci-fi? Are they necessarily the same thing? Are they always the same thing? Can they be different?
That is an excellent question, and it's subject to interpretation. In my opinion, post-apocalyptic does not necessarily have to be scientific, although it generally is, and here's why. In all post-apocalyptic fiction, there has to be that extinction event, that situation where we go from our regular day-to-day, going to work every morning life, and where everything gets swept away. A lot of times that's the result of a technology brought on by man, a nuclear weapon, a black hole device. We send signals out into space, which brings the aliens down. The aliens destroy us and then leave, and then we're trying to rebuild. A plague. The plague can often be brought on by trying to bioengineer germ warfare that goes awry. But it doesn't have to be. It could be something as simple as Night of the Comet. It's this comet that comes around every 250 million years. That has nothing to do with human intervention or human action. So now, and again, science fiction, it's always about some scientific element which is a game changer in civilization. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that in Apocalypse. It could be, as you even hinted at earlier, it could be divine intervention.
Right.
Or demonic intervention. The devil comes onto Earth and destroys it to see if he can get any followers. We've seen that in some films as well. So, but for simplicity's sake, like I worked at a video store for 6 years. I don't know if you remember Sunco's Video. We were like Sam Goody, only sold movies instead of music. We would normally categorize post-apocalyptic with the sci-fi because that's where people would look for it when they came in to buy it.
Yeah, so it would really have to be really extraneous for it to not be a sci-fi film as well. Like post-apocalyptic seems to almost be a subgenre of sci-fi films.
That's how I categorize it. Yes.
Yeah, and it would almost have to be very extraneous for it to not be to be a post-apocalyptic and not be sci-fi. That's interesting. All right, so let's I'm gonna throw another one your way, and I forgot the name of it. It's not I want to say Cyborg. It's got Jean-Claude Van Damme in it.
Oh yes, someone was just asking me about this one the other day.
I think it was 1990 or 1989 or something like that.
I was going to say I know the one you're talking about, but I haven't seen that one since I was in college. I went through a very brief phase where I was into Jean-Claude Van Damme. You probably had a longer phase because you were more into martial arts. But I remember seeing it, but I remember very, very little about it. In fact, I believe it came up because someone was asking about a crossover martial arts post-apocalyptic films, and I suggested Six String Samurai. Say that 5 times fast, and that's actually kind of fun. That's one of the very, very few post-apocalyptic light comedies. It takes place after World War III, and it's basically this Elvis impersonator who manages to survive, and he finds a samurai sword and goes on adventures and finds someone who may represent the last hope of rebuilding the world. And it's a sort of romp that I highly recommend. I remember just being fun both for action and comedy. But the Van Damme classic, which the actual title eludes me for the moment, never really made a big splash with me.
It eludes me too. I had it on VHS, and that's kind of why I remember. I've watched it a few times. You know, it's one of those VHSs you just throw in where you're washing dishes or something, so you can kind of watch it. But yeah, I mean, most all at least, post-apocalyptic shows or movies, you have the element of like you said, the mutants, but you also have the bad guys, the guys who are plundering and stuff, who kind of rally around this one main guy or something, who's the bad guy, and then the good guys have got to fight not just the zombies or the mutants, but it's got to fight the bad guys as well. And I remember that because Jean-Claude Van Damme played the good guy, and then some other actor, I forgot, he always plays the bad guy. I think he was also in that Snake movie or Cobra with Sylvester Stallone as well. And yeah, he played a bad guy in that, and of course they have to fight, and they kill his family, and then later he takes revenge, and they're up in the mountains somewhere, and then they find him and they rape and murder everybody except him, and then now he's walking through and the world to find vengeance and just live, kind of a thing. So well, tell me like some of your favorite of the 80s before we start moving into the 90s. What are some of your favorite ones of the 80s? And
of my favorite ones of the 80s? Well, one thing before we get too far, I have to discuss what, in my opinion, is the alpha patient of the post-apocalyptic genre on a couple of levels. It actually, believe it or not, it goes back to the 1930s, and it's Things to Come. It's actually based on an H.G. Wells novella.
Okay.
And this is actually kind of cool because it's not post-World War III, it's post-World War II. This was made before the Second World War, but they at the time envisioned if there was a Second World War, that it would destroy the global economy. And what happens is, with the use of long-range bomber aircraft, all the infrastructure in the world is destroyed. The global economy collapses, and they revert to basically brigandinism. I can never get that word right, where it's almost like in the Middle Ages, where there's like these tiny pockets of warlords form their own little separate countries and squabble amongst each other. And one of the main ones we see is played by late great Sir Ralph Richardson, and he plays the coolest warlord, and he takes over what is effectively southern England. And one of the most, before I get too far, I have to mention this as well. It is possibly the first depiction of what I would refer to as your pandemic zombie in cinema history. A lot of people give it to, of course, and you have to, George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, which is the alpha patient of the zombie subgenre. But as a subplot to things to come, through experimentation with, germ warfare, dead bodies in a comatose state get up and wander around like zombies spreading the contagion. Prior to that, the only zombies you saw in cinema were the more religious angle zombies with black magic from Haiti and that type of thing. In this case, they're actually the Walking Dead. And so you basically got a twofer there. You got the first film, which discusses the possibility of a destroyed civilization, and the first one, which discusses the possibility of the dead coming back to life and killing people. So people who they want to start with something, start with things to come. I'm going to skip back ahead now to the 1980s. And of course, The Road Warrior, that one was great. One of my personal favorites, though, this is a guilty pleasure because it's kind of a risque movie. A lot of these post-apocalyptic films in the 80s were on the risque side. One's called Phoenix the Warrior, also known as She-Wolves of the Wasteland, I think.
Okay.
And it's a similar premise. What happens is because of some experimentation in medical research, all the men on the earth are wiped out. And so all you have left are these very conveniently scantily clad women wandering a wasteland, fighting each other, like something out of Red Sonja or something like that. And our main character, Phoenix, stumbles across what may be the last men on Earth. And they try to come up with a plan to basically repopulate. And, well, I don't want to give the game away, but you can see where this is going.
For sure.
And that was one of my favorites. Another good one is Radioactive Dreams, which is it's wacky, but it's a lot of fun. Two children who are locked in a fallout shelter decide they want to emerge 15, 20 years later after the bombs have dropped and basically see what the earth is like. The problem is they've been locked in with no entertainment other than some old war films. So they walk around in these sort of zoot suits and use expressions from the 1940s and jitterbug dance, and and they go on these adventures with like mutants and warriors, and it's just trippy, but it's a lot of fun. And a lot of these films were done tongue in cheek. Some of them were serious, very serious, dark, but a lot of them were sort of spoofs, and the spoofs were so much fun. Do you remember it all? You may have been a little young. There was a TV series. It ran late night on the old USA network. It was called USA Up All Night with Gilbert Gottfried and Carolyn Stick, later Rhonda Spear. And they would show these old schlocky sci-fi horror movies going into the morning. And they used to love to show these sort of post-apocalyptic.
I don't remember that at all.
You might have been a little young. I was in college, so my mother didn't tell me to go to bed at 2 a.m. I could stay up and watch.
Well, I remember the USA was on the USA Network.
It sure was. Was.
Well, when did the USA Network come out?
That's got to be early 80s. I want to say.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Early 80s, yeah.
I didn't know that. Well, so tell me a little bit about the religious element in some of these apocalyptic movies that you've seen. What apocalyptic shows would you say kind of have a more or less religious element to them as being a driving force? You mentioned some of these before. I mean, I know that there were a lot, and I don't know if you've seen these or not, but there were a slew of it wasn't even made for TV or direct to video kind of movies. They were just these movies that came on like TBN and things like that. And I'm not sure exactly like all the producers, but there was like A Cry in the Night and the Left Behind is probably the most popular
most well known with
of
Kirk Cameron.
yeah, with Kirk Cameron. But what
There
other
was
ones
also
were there? Do you know of any
well,
other?
I count the Omega Code.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I count the Omega Code, even though the majority of the story takes place before Armageddon. There is some afterwards, but I do count that because it is about that epic battle between good and evil. And if I remember correctly, I'm going back quite a ways. I believe, though, in the 70s and into the 80s, and I don't know the name of it, so I'm not going to speculate, but there was actually a Christian film production company that produced some. They didn't have huge budgets, but they made a lot of films. It was sort of like your Davy and Goliath message. I mean, they were films, but they had a very strong Christian message to them.
Yes.
And some of them were actually done in a post-apocalyptic setting because, bear in mind, I heard you mention the rapture earlier. In like 82, 83, 84, and you could thank President Reagan for this, the rapture was on a lot of people's lips.
Oh yeah,
A lot of people really thought it was around the corner. And some films actually referenced that. I remember a girl who was a friend of mine, was an evangelical Christian, and was telling me, you have to see this movie because she knew that I liked the subgenre. It's a Christian movie, but it's about these people who were in hiding. It's sort of like it was like the Diary of Anne Frank. What happens is the devil takes over, and you have to have the mark of the beast and all that. And it's this group of Christians that are hiding in an attic, like Anne Frank did.
Right.
And they're hiding from the demonic soldiers.
Right.
And I never saw it. I never even found the name of it. But it sounded like they put a lot of thought into it. So
Yeah.
I would certainly count that as post-apocalyptic. I mean, because again, the apocalypse, it is a religious theme.
Yeah, I had seen a bunch of budget films kind of, and then a lot of films that were there's really like a slew of these 45-minute half-hour films that kind of like I don't even know where they just come on TV now and again, and they're normally on some type of religious television programming to some degree. But there were some movies too, where people had the fake mark and stuff, and they'd scratch it off, and they're like, no, I'm a Christian, it's a fake mark so that I don't get pulled over or something like that. I mean, that was a big deal too, and it kind of the late 70s and the 80s was just a hodgepodge both of religious and non-religious vibe of this apocalyptic kind of thing, and to a degree the religious side definitely put logs on the fire. They weren't the only ones putting logs on the fire, but they were putting logs on the fire nonetheless, because they believed, still believe that the Antichrist is coming, and a great majority of them believe that they're going to be taken off the earth. There was a book out called The Late Great Planet Earth. I don't know if you ever heard of that book or not, by Hal Lindsey. By the way, just so anybody out there is listening, I don't believe in the late great planet Earth. I don't believe in that theory, just so you know, just in case you're wondering about me personally, my own personal theology. But it was one of those things. It's just like you said, that in the 80s, the rapture was just on everybody's lips. And of course, you had with Reagan, the imminent doom of a nuclear holocaust. And it was like all these things are going to come together, and any minute now it's going to be the end of the world. And it was in the movies, but it was also what we thought. I mean, I grew up thinking that this is going to happen any second, like there's going to be the rise of of course, mine was from more of a religious bent, but there were a lot of people who weren't. A lot of people were just like, oh, it's going to be World War III, and it's going to, or the economy is going to collapse. And, our money's no good anyway. It's just inflation. It's just a piece of paper. And we're going to have to go back to the goal. And pretty soon the economy is going to, I'm sure you've heard all this stuff before, but that goes into all those films that we love. And we love to think about them as well. I was going somewhere with that, and I kind of forgot. I do want to move. Oh, go ahead.
I'd like to interject for just one thing. When you say we love them and enjoy them, and one of the things, and I mentioned this in one of my earlier posts when I was doing literature, you'd think in this age, don't even want to say post-pandemic because we're still in the pandemic. So in this pandemic age, I guess you'd say, you'd think post-apocalyptic fiction would seem off-putting. Like I don't want to see grim things. I want to see Mary Poppins and nice stuff. And the weirdest thing is, and in my studies, I've found that when things look darkest, people seem to take more solace in post-apocalyptic literature. And it's almost cathartic. It's almost more soothing. I don't know if it's in our minds. We empathize with the characters, so it makes us feel better about our own predicament, or the fact that, well, these people managed to survive, so can I. I'm not sure what it is, but it just seems the darker things get, the more we love it. And again, there is a certain amount of, like, for example, when you watch Things to Come, and I'm sure you will, when you watch Things to Come, take a look at the Chief is the name of the warlord. And when I first saw this movie when I was in high school, I'm like, I'm going to be the Chief.
Yes.
I can picture myself being him.
Right.
And so we put ourselves we try to see it in a sense of adventure almost. And perhaps we shouldn't, but we do.
Yeah.
And it's a guilty pleasure. And call me guilty.
Guilty. Yes,
Yeah,
I know.
guilty.
Me too.
So,
me as well. Well, one
saying.
religious that came out much later, but we'll bring it up anyway. But one, more modern, and it's also has, I don't know if it's totally religious, but it has a religious bent to it, and that's the Book of Eli. I thought that was a great movie. I mean, that was a really good a post-apocalyptic show. I thought that Denzel Washington did an amazing job in that, and that was a lot of fun. Let's move into the 90s a little bit, because I want to bring up a guy whose name is spoken of good and bad for different reasons, and that is Kevin Costner. And he had two post-apocalyptic movies, at least two that I know of, post-apocalyptic movies. One of them was good and one of them was horrible. And I'll let you decide which one's good.
Let me guess. Go ahead. Waterworld was at one time the biggest commercial disappointment in film history.
Right.
I don't know if it still is, but it was. I've seen Waterworld on several occasions, and for no other reason than I look for redeeming qualities to it. And it's not a total loss. Dennis Hopper put his heart and soul into that performance, and I thought he did very well. Some of the side actors I thought were interesting. Some of the premises were interesting. I don't want to give anything away, but on the whole, the movie was not a success. And the biggest problem I had with it, and I'm not knocking the man, but Kevin Costner looked bored out of his mind the entire time.
Yeah.
I don't know if he made that film with a gun to his head or what, but it was like Liam Neeson in The Phantom Menace. It wasn't that he gave a bad performance. It was just, you could tell he was phoning it in. And it really suffered. So yes, Waterworld was the not good one. The Postman was actually a far superior film, and I think The Postman would have had way more traction had it come out first. But because it came out after Waterworld, and everybody went, oh, another Kevin Costner, forget it. They didn't give it a chance. I heard he was actually going to do a third one, which was going to be about a post-apocalyptic baseball team.
Oh, you're kidding.
Yes, I am. He made so many baseball movies too. He was going to put the two together.
He made, what was that one that he made? If you build it, they will come. What's the name?
Field of Dreams, and Bull Durham was another biggie. That was early in his career. Both of which I loved, by the way. Both are very, very fun films.
Yeah. I never saw Bull Durham, and I never saw Tin Cup, so I don't know. I liked, I'll have to admit that Waterworld at one time was a little bit of a guilty pleasure for me. One of those movies that you go, I know that I'm not supposed to like it. It's kind of cheesy, but I did like it, but I didn't love it. You know what I mean? It was,
it's not without merit. It's not a total loss film.
I didn't hate it the way everybody else hated it. Let's just put it that way.
Well
I mean,
stated,
if
well
it was
stated.
on, I could watch it and sit through it, and people were like, "Well, yeah, I get it. It's not the best film, but I'm not like, wanting to walk out of the room or turn something else on. It's just an okay film. It's just one of those films that wasn't great. But I thought The Postman was amazing. I really enjoyed The Postman.
Me too.
I was like,
And
how come people aren't liking this? But it goes to your point that it came out second. And so all the stuff about Waterworld and then plus his performance. I mean, okay, I don't begrudge any actors. They try to do their best, but honestly, his performance is pretty flat in most things. Let's just be honest. I mean, Robin Hood, another guilty pleasure, really liked it, but I mean, he just doesn't seem excited about too much stuff. So I get that his performance is flat, but even in but what was I going to say? I forgot. I was going somewhere with that. But the Postman, I thought that was an excellent show. I thought it was an excellent premise. I thought the bad guy was a good bad guy. I thought that it was pretty ingenious that he picked up these letters and then he tried to go to a town and he started this kind of new thing, kind of out of whole cloth. I thought it was a good show. What do you think?
Oh yeah, the premise of it was great. The fact that he puts on the mailman's winter uniform so he doesn't freeze to death.
Mm-hmm.
And then when he wanders into the town, they automatically think, can we talk about the difference between dystopian and post-apocalyptic? I can't speak today. But when he shows up, they're like, vital services have been restored.
Right.
And just the premise, just the idea that things are getting back online was enough to restore hope. First in a small part of the country, then the entire country. And how at the end he basically becomes a legend, which is very important. People have to believe in things to get their hearts started, as the saying goes. And I thought that was a very important message. Sometimes there's an old saying: small disasters cause panic, panic causes big ones. What you really need in any given situation is you need people to cling to hope.
Uh-huh.
If they can cling to hope, they might be okay. Once they abandon all hope, you've already lost whether or not the situation is fixable or not. And the Postman presents us that message, and I thought it was an excellent one. And it was a really pity that it came out after Waterworld.
Yeah,
I mean, critics were calling it Dirt World just to sort of rub his nose in it.
The first one happened on water and the second one happened on land.
So it's Dirt World.
Yeah, Dirt World. That makes sense. Yeah, I thought that it was night and day difference, and I thought that it got a bad rap, like you said, because it came out afterwards. But that's one of those shows that I thought was really good. Let's move into the 90s then, because I'm interested in hearing some of your favorites of the 90s.
Well, see, I don't specifically break mine down by decade.
Okay.
So
what? Well, how would you break it down? Let's go there.
Being from working in the film store all those years, there's old, like ones from like the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and then 70s, 80s, 90s, and then I would probably break it down into the 21st century. So to me, a lot of them blend together. As far as the 21st century goes, some of the best has actually been more of the TV entertainment we've discussed. We've discussed the Walking Dead franchise. So that's probably what I'm most familiar with now. Or, of course, the high watermark of the subgenre, which would be Cormac McCarthy's The Road. Have you read that or seen the movie?
I've not read it, and I tried to watch it, and I just couldn't get through it. It was very depressing. I think I got through up to where the mother killed herself. And by the way, there's always going to be spoilers on this show. You just gotta. I'm sorry, it's a spoiler show. We are talking about shows we've seen or, whatever. So there's the. But yeah, where Charlize Theron kind of offs herself, and then And then I don't remember a lot of it. No, I don't remember.
If you read the book, the movie, I wouldn't say the movie is fun compared to the book, but they took some things out of the movie. I'm thinking just for basically the grounds of good taste that were in the book that will haunt your nightmares if you read it. So if you didn't look at the movie, do yourself a favor, do not read the book.
Okay.
Because there's some downright disturbing imagery that I won't share with you.
Well, there's alluded to stuff that goes on that I mean, even if the book scratched the surface of that, what the movie points to, basically like the father telling the son, save this bullet for yourself, because of what these guys are going to do to you if they catch you. And I just was like, okay, all right. So if the book goes anywhere, down that road, yes, I could see how the book would just be awful. I mean, just really difficult to even get through.
It's amazingly well written. And it's written almost in stream of consciousness. Like the person writing it, he's not sitting down at a desk writing out a screenplay. It's this man in this post-apocalyptic world, and he's basically writing things down as he feels them. So you sort of get into the mind of this survivor. It's incredibly well done, but it's not for the weak of heart.
Oh, I see. That does make sense. Well, what about the books that came out during this time, though? Was there a lot of books being produced in like the 70s, 80s, and 90s about post-apocalyptic? I mean, I know the religious books, because Left Behind was a movie, but it was also a series of novels. But was there other books that came out during this time about post-apocalyptic?
Several. Many of them became films in their own right. Oftentimes varying wildly from the source material, but up there. The Mist by Stephen King.
Oh yeah.
Which became a movie, was actually based on a novella. One of my personal favorites, I don't know, have we discussed Brian Wilson Aldiss? He's my favorite writer of all time. He's an English sci-fi writer. He's best known for he wrote the short story that AI was based on, which is my favorite short story is. He also did something called Frankenstein Unbound, which was made into a feature film by Roger Corman, which is pretty solid and arguably post-apocalyptic in and of its own right, but there's 3 different periods to it. So one could make a valid case, or one could say it's more of a time travel movie. But anyway, he wrote many post-apocalyptic short stories, but he wrote a novel called Greybeard, which is possibly my favorite in the subgenre. Because of some above-ground atomic testing, the Van Allen belts around the Earth fall down to the surface briefly, but just long enough to give all life on Earth radiation sickness. They survive that, but afterwards, as a post-condition, all higher mammals are now sterilized. And this man, who was a kid at the time, 5 years old, is now the last generation. And through a series of flashbacks, we get to see the world devolve in what is basically the last generation. And he walks us through it. And it's an amazingly well thought out book. I mean, he really put some thought into what it would be like if you were literally the last generation on Earth. What this world would be like for you. And it's funny how initially it's more dystopian. They try to keep the economy going. Ironically, the first people hit are the people who make biblical stories for small children. There's no small children, they go out of business. And then the next thing is the music industry, because they're geared towards teenagers. No teenagers, no music industry. And then ultimately the world devolves into total war. And what they do is these countries put together basically marauding armies. They go into the third world to try to gather up the handful of children who are still being born and drag them back to England or Germany or France or Japan or America. And so they're basically fighting each other to try to get these last handful of small children. And guess what happens while they're fighting? Most of the handful of remaining children end up getting killed in the carnage. It's this very disturbing story. And in the end, there is a hopeful postscript. he and his wife Martha come up with this idea that maybe things aren't quite as bad or as bleak as they think. But again, it's called Graybeard, and it's arguably the best post-apocalyptic novel written in my experience. I think a lot of people have said to me that they go, "Do you think it influenced Children of Men?"
That was the one I was thinking about. I was kind of waiting for a break there to think about Children of Men, because that's basically their kids just stopped being born.
Mm-hmm.
It was a good movie.
And I think that movie was influenced by Graybeard quite a bit.
Yeah. There were some television shows that came out that didn't take off, kind of like The Walking Dead. And I watched the first season and a half of Walking Dead. I just didn't kind of interest me, but it really is more of a post-apocalyptic show than it is a zombie show. The zombies are just the mutant element of it, and everything else is like, how are we going to survive now that we don't have an economy, and now that we don't, kind of the hunter-gatherer thing that you mentioned. But there were a few different shows that came out that actually piqued my interest, that I don't know, for one reason or another, didn't do so well. And one of them was Jericho. Remember that movie or that television show? Yeah, and I don't even know if it made it through one season or not. I can't remember. But it was short-lived, but I thought it was really good.
I think it shot itself in the foot. Skeet Ulrich, I believe, was a star in that. And it did make it through the first season. And the first season, spoiler alert, it culminates with, which is something that could conceivably take place in a post-extinction event America. We balkanize, and various regions basically become their own states and end up fighting each other. And the first season ends with these two towns going to war with each other, and one of them prevailing. And it made a nice wrap up for that season. When it came back, though, they decided to skip ahead many, many months. And it's moving into a post collapse civilization. And I thought the interesting thing about that is the organization, which is trying to bring the government back together, has some nefarious elements to it, and it's almost like, well, can we trust these people? Can we not trust these people? Long story short, there's an implication that they may have triggered the collapse simply so they could take over the country, and it was some type of coup d'état.
Really, some type of conspiracy theory.
Bingo. And the problem is, great idea. That's not what I signed on for.
Yeah.
I signed on for this sort of post-apocalyptic thing, not a political intrigue thing.
Right.
And I think they lost a lot of their viewership that way. Very similar to Sliders. Do you remember the TV series Sliders?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Where every week they had a completely separate adventure.
Yep.
And then they decided they were going to go the fugitive one-arm man angle. And they were going to have these recurring enemies, the Cro-Mags.
Yes,
and it was
right.
Like, no, it was much better microcosmic. When you have a running thread, now you've lost me.
Yeah, that show kind of just phased out. I stopped watching it kind of around that time.
Me too.
Honestly, kind of about the time that they jumped the shark when they started bringing Jerry O'Connell's brother into the show. And then I was like, And then they started losing characters and they had to replace them. And like totally different actors, but playing the same part or something like that. And it was like, I don't know. At least that's what I remember. There was another one, and then I can't remember when it was out. And I think I've only watched like a few episodes. And then the episodes, and then I'll get into this one. Then I kind of want to talk about the future of this genre, and then we can call it good. We've been doing this for a little bit here, but it was about where it was a television show, and all of the electronics quit. Remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember that show? I don't know, and it was kind of like a girl power, kind of like a what's that girl with the bow and arrow? That kind of
the Hunger Games.
Yeah, kind of that, but on television.
Yes, I do remember it.
But I don't know which came out first. I know there's probably the books came out first, but I remember it was a television show where all the electricity vanished. Do you remember that? I don't know if you remember that.
It was a very short-lived series, but I do remember it.
Yeah.
And in fact, I believe it was canceled before I started watching it, but I do remember
Yeah.
the series. Yes,
Yeah.
and they do that actually quite a lot. A lot of times, you never know what actually happened. It's not important.
Hmm.
Uh, Remember, there's a great scene in The Day After, we were talking about that earlier, where there's survivors on the college campus, and they go to the library and find an old crystal radio, which wasn't destroyed by the EMP. And they actually get a news broadcast. And when the news broadcast ends, one of the kids says, "Well, it's disappointing. I want to know who started the war." And the professor looks at him and says, "Doesn't matter."
Yeah. Right.
Um, so one, it doesn't really matter what caused the event. Two, most people wouldn't have the luxury of being that well informed.
Oh yeah.
They do
Yeah.
that in the road. The guy, he's just trying to survive. I mean, there's an implication of the nuclear war, but he never finds out. One of the things that's kind of I don't want to say a cop out, but it's almost unnecessary exposition is you'll go to see one of these movies and there'll be a scroll and it will fill you in the entire backstory.
Right.
And that's kind of nice, but you don't need that.
Hmm.
All you need to know is that the main character is having a really tough time
Yeah.
and the
Right.
world has gone to crap, and how is he going to survive?
Right. Right.
And again, I wish I could remember. I wonder if it's on Netflix, because I do remember that I believe it was based on a series of books.
Mm.
Some of them took place, I want to say, on Nantucket, just across the water from me. I'm on the Cape. But you got me intrigued. Like, I do recall it. I just, again, it was canceled before I had a chance to see
Right.
it.
Right. And I only saw like 2 episodes, maybe 3 at the most. But I got to plug in one post-apocalyptic ish show that was on, I think it was on Prime. I think it's on Prime, and it's terrific. It's called The Last Ship. Did you see The Last Ship?
At the time, I was working a lot of nights when that was on. I have the novel. Someone gave me the novel as a gift. I have it
Oh,
somewhere. Yes,
I haven't.
but I've never saw the actual miniseries.
Yeah, well, it came out before I think it ran like 3 or 4 seasons. So it's more than just a mini series. Yeah, it's a great,
Okay.
it's
I thought it was just
really
2, but-
good. It
Yeah.
might have been 2. I don't know. I don't remember these things sometimes. Especially if it's something I haven't gone back and watched more than once, and I only watched through that one time. But basically it came out before the pandemic we are now living through came out. But basically there's a ship, and it's up in the Arctic, and they are they're looking for a cure for this thing that's just kind of newly happening. But and it's a military ship, and by the time they come back, it's gone through populations dying, sub societies are rising up and taking over, and then there's this military ship that's come back from this captain who basically has to almost restore, because they've got the cure. So and so they're trying to restore things back to normal and stuff like that. So it's a really good show. It's very intriguing. It's one of the very few shows that I will put my stamp of approval on and say, well, you might like this, you might not. Of course, that's true with a lot of things, but this is one of them. I might definitely check that out. Real quick, what do you think the future of the genre is? Because it's still a big deal today. What do you think shows in the future are going to be like? Do you think we're going to continue to crank them out? What are they going to be like? Just your opinion on if you could speculate for a moment.
I think we will. There'll always be a room for it. There'll
Mhm.
always be a place in our hearts for it. For whatever reason, and I think it will probably continue just as it is. There's been a push over the last 20, 30 years to make them more and more scientifically plausible. Hence the science fiction angle. In the old days, vampires were just demons that drank
Right.
blood. When Guillermo del Toro made The Strain series, he explained them scientifically. And he wasn't the first person to do that. Brian Aldiss wrote a book called Dracula Unbound, where he explains how vampirism started through scientific means. So you'll see more and more scientific means. We might see a pandemic post-apocalyptic TV series down the road. Perhaps if we get a little further away from our current predicament. Alien invasions are always good. Sadly, war is always a chance. The books of Nostradamus are endless fodder for that type of entertainment. So I think they'll probably continue, and if anything, they'll probably just get more and more ramped up in production value. One thing I will see, and it's an ongoing movement, and I think I don't want to say worse, because that means I'm demeaning it, but one thing you will see is there'll tend to be the increasing movement towards soap operas. Like The Walking Dead is a soap opera set in a zombie apocalypse. They'll continue to be that way because the human interest angle is really what keeps the show going. You tune in for your favorite characters, not your favorite plot point. Did he hook up with she? Are these two still together? Did he leave her for him? Whatever. You will continue to see that. And so it'll be like Dallas, only in a post-extinction event.
Be like Melrose Place with the neighbors being All right.
Zombies are mutants.
Thank you so much, Thrash. Please let everybody know where they can find you.
Well, you can find me. I'm putting together an updated channel. The summers are always crazy for me, but you can still find my soon-to-be vintage material at Thrashpondo Pond's YouTube post. That's capital T HRASHPONDO, capital PONS. That's the best place to find me, and be waiting for some new material. I'm putting together some stuff as we speak. Oh, and by the way, I want to thank you. I've gotten a slew of new subscribers in the last couple of weeks, and they all seem to have come from the material that you and I are doing together. So I want to thank you for helping me get my new subscribers, and thank you all who have subscribed.
Yeah, well, it's a team effort for sure. I mean, you're keeping my fire fueled up for Monday nights and then our Thursdays and stuff like that. And I can't wait for our next book versus movie, which is going to be Lord of the Flies. So I got to crack into that, though. I haven't quite cracked into that yet. But just want to thank everybody for tuning in. If you are listening to this on podcast, please give me a review and a rating. That would mean the world to me, and share it on your favorite social media. Also, know that we have a YouTube channel. If you're on the YouTube channel, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, hit the share button. The bell notification would mean the world to me. Also, if you want to go a little extra step, whether you're listening on a podcast or watching it on YouTube, you are welcome to head on over to our Patreon page, where you can become a supporter. For just $3 a month, you can do the tip jar, or for $5 a month, you can be part of the Cornflake Club, which is early releases on all videos and on all podcasts. But it only includes the videos and the podcast. It does not include, it doesn't include the live stream. So the live stream is just live. Everybody's welcome to join in. Soon though, and I haven't quite been able to put this together, just bear with me, but I'm going to be creating the Honeycomb Hideout. It's going to happen. I know things move slow. And Honeycomb Hideout is going to have exclusive material. You're only going to get it if you're part of the Honeycomb Hideout. So head on over. And then also, if you are listening to this on podcast only, know that the YouTube channel does have YouTube stuff. So if you like what we're doing here, you'll like what we're doing over there too. You know, we have shorter videos and stuff. I just did a what did I do? I did three
TV shows from the 80s.
Yeah, TV shows that were based on movies. So it's just stuff, you know, more YouTube oriented, but still about the same genre, about growing up Generation X. So all right, everyone, thank you very much, and we will talk to you again real soon. Stay retro, everyone.